Hi, everyone. I'm Diego Mazzocato. I have a degree in PE. I'm a physiotherapist and instructor of Nordic Walking at ANWI, Nordic Walking Association of Italy, in Treviso, Italy. I have recently started working together with Gable, a leader in the production of winter sports equipment and Nordic Walking equipment. The company has patented a product which is going to revolutionize the way we perform Nordic Walking. It's called e-poles. E-poles represent a particular type of pole that register data and results of Nordic Walking sessions. This top-of-the-line product can evaluate our physical activity, movements, techniques of Nordic Walking sessions. Thus, we can measure the kinematic aspects of this physical activity. Let's start our lecture and learn more about Nordic Walking and the e-poles by Gable. The content of this lecture is part of the other educational presentations. In this particular lecture, we will talk about endurance sports, type of muscle strengths, and also evaluate motor tests and their application in these sports, for example, in Nordic Walking. Before talking about this evaluation of motor tests, we should first define and understand the object that we need to evaluate, its components, its purpose. Let's first give definition to physical activity. It defines any bodily movement produced by skeletal muscles, contractions resulting in a significant increase of caloric needs higher than usual energetic expenditures that we spend during the rest time. We know perfectly that even during leisure time, our body consumes and spends calories and energy to maintain our vital processes. For example, internal muscle contractions, cardiac, respiratory muscle contractions. All the muscles that work without our consciousness to keep us alive, all of them, muscles and systems of muscles, consume energy and calories all the time. And we can conclude that physical activity could be described as a voluntary bodily movement that requires more energy expenditure than our natural metabolic activities. Thus, exercise is a type of physical activity made up of bodily movements which are quite often planned, structured, and repetitive to keep us and our body fit. The difference between physical activity and exercise is that the former relates to a simple series of muscle contractions, and the later relates to planned, precise, repetitive movements aimed at improving physical state. Then, another question. What is a physical state? It's an ability of a human being to perform tasks regularly with certain energy and attention, but without the extreme fatigue. It should also leave us with the same power to enjoy our lives in our free time and to be able to react to impromptu emergencies. We can say that a person in a good physical state can carry out exercises of a certain intensity, spending some energy with minimum fatigue and maintaining energy to continue with other daily activities. To understand better the idea of physical state, let's turn to mechanics, or rather energy efficiency. Energy efficiency refers to the ability of a physical system to obtain a certain result with less energy consumed. A person from this point of view is more efficient or active as he is able to obtain certain results, physical results, by spending less energy, being less tired, and still having some spare energy in the end. Or in other words, it is a physical efficiency to satisfy regular and complex metabolic needs of daily life and physical activities in a way that leaves us active and energetic during our spare time. Another aspect that we need to mention is physical condition. Physical condition refers to a present or obtained physical quality of a person to perform physical activity. This aspect is very important, and it's closely connected with physical exercises, motor abilities. We will discuss this matter in greater detail later in this lecture. It is worth mentioning that some of our abilities are innate. Example, determined by our genes, and they are also changed if we train them. Thus, deliberate practice and consistency of training can influence and change our physical condition or state. Instead, performance is a form of physical efficiency, capacity to do sports as a desired level. Performance capacity level increases thanks to the constant and specific training aimed at obtaining certain results and enhancing abilities in particular sport activities. We can conclude that performance refers to physical efficiency in sports. It's a level of progression towards excellence or achievement. Physical state. Physical efficiency state is closely connected with health and capabilities of a person. Better health leads to higher physical state and abilities to perform motor movements without physical overexertion, but with some extra energy at the end of sports sessions. Person's capabilities that are essential while doing any sports are cardiorespiratory resistance, muscle strength and endurance, muscle flexibility, and body composition. Let's start with the cardiorespiratory, also called cardiovascular resistance. It's the ability of your heart, lungs, blood vessels to deliver sufficient amount of oxygen to cells during a continuous physical activity. It is extremely important during endurance sports and marathons. For example, in a long and intensive endurance exercise, an athlete mostly relies on his cardiovascular system to supply him continuously with oxygen needed to produce energy in cells to accomplish his exercise or a marathon. Muscle strength is the muscular ability to exert a maximum amount of force against resistance. We can see it vividly when, for example, a weightlifter wins over resistance, expressed by a barbell with weight plates. In 1 RM, maximum repetition, in other words, it is the maximum load that a muscle can overcome or move. And there's muscle resistance that is defined as the ability to exert submaximal force continuously against given resistance. A great example is a rugby session in which quite strong muscle contractions don't reach their maximum. For example, in push the scrim, muscles engage like that in all of the phases of force exertion of high but not maximum intensity during different sports and competitions. Flexibility is a range of movement in a joint or a joint capacity to move through its complete range of motion, ROM. In other words, the capacity to go through its complete arc of movements. Then let's go to our next perimeter, body composition. It is another significant component of our physical condition. Body composition is a relative ratio of fat, bone mass, and other body mass. It refers to the percentage of fat, lean mass in relation to total body mass. It is a key aspect if what to find our ideal body weight, about which we will talk about later in this lecture. We have talked about components required to describe physical efficiency. All of them are connected with the cardiovascular, cardiocirculatory organs and muscles. Now, let's turn to some other characteristics that are more subtle, more specific. They have a great impact on our central and peripheral nervous system. They represent 6 neuromuscular traits: agility, balance, coordination, speed, power, and reaction time. Agility is a capacity to change and control our body's position fast, efficiently, and exactly how we need to do it. A great example of agility can be seen during our parkour training or running, during which people move fast and overcome different obstacles while constantly moving. Balance is the capacity to maintain the body's bar central or balance, whether stationary or while moving. A typical example of balance can be seen in artistic gymnastics, where support base is limited and forces an athlete to find ways to maintain his or her balance. And coordination is another capacity that helps us use our senses as vision, hearing together with body parts to move correctly and continuously. Another example would be from martial arts that require work from the whole body to produce fast, smooth, continuous movements to combine them in order to achieve a certain goal. Power, in its turn, is the ability to exert a maximum force at a fast speed in a short period of time. A great example of power sport is boxing, where a boxer does a lot of movements, attacks to reach a certain goal in a short period of time. Speed is the ability to move our body as fast as possible. Some examples include athletic sprints as 100 meters, for example. And reaction time is the time that lies between a stimulus and a response, initiation to that stimulus to move. A classical example in sports that place a huge attention on reaction time is fencing, where the ability of an athlete to identify response to patterns of movements of another fencer can be overrated. To complete our introduction into motor capacities and skills, you can have a look at the table with other different motor capacities. If you are willing to know more, I highly recommend reading some books by Bloom. He is known for a classification of capacities and motor abilities. We move to the main topic of our lecture, the motor ability test. Motor ability tests are ways to measure level of motor capacities such as power, resistance, speed, and other ability. We know that these capacities are abstract, and they are quite hard to measure precisely. Still, we can use particular indicators to get closer to the values. What are these indicators? They are elements which can be precisely accessed and indicate perimeters that are accurately correlated to abstract elements in theory and methodology of a training. To make it more simple, let's provide an example. Capacity of cardiovascular endurance is definitely an abstract notion and doesn't have units in physics to be measured. What do? Instead, we can measure heart rate. In other words, the number of heartbeats per minute during an athlete's performance. We can also measure a distance covered in a particular period of time. Let's say meters per second or per minute, and the heart rate of an athlete who ran that distance. In a nutshell, we measure units that can be qualified in physics when performing a particular task in a training, and that fully correlated with physical capacities, in this case, the capacity of cardiovascular endurance. A good test should have the following characteristics: standardization, objectivity, specificity, validity, and reliability. Standardization helps to compare different results of every participant of a group or results of different groups. This is possible due to standardization and unification of all tasks during motor tests. Thus, task instructions, execution, and measurements should stay unified, invariable for all stages of a test. Validity is the concept that guarantees us that we can measure and decode well motor ability and any other parameter we want to qualify. The parameter should be valid and relevant to a referred quality. In other words, the physical ability that we exert should be relevant to the motor capacity we want to test. Objectivity is a point of concordance and consistency, which can be used by different accessors to read accurate measurements of a test. It depends on a test method. For instance, hand timing won't have the same objectivity as automatic timing. Objectivity also depends on the level of standardization and the right application of various aspects of a test standardization by a participant. Another key feature is reliability, which refers to the same test scores when repeated with the passage of time. The test can be considered more reliable if the same participants give the same performance in the same conditions and time. If conditions remain the same, the measurements should be the same or very close to the previous ones. The last feature is specificity. The perimeter is called selective or specific when it's able to eliminate different components not relevant to the test and access important characteristics or particular activity. This selective factor depends on accuracy of a test and a possibility to break down and evaluate parts of an exercise. In this case, we can face more accurate measurements and results. There is American College of Sport Medicine that is well known internationally for its scientific research. It regularly publishes instructions on how to access tests when we prescribe physical activity. In the next slide, you will see some guidelines for conducting motor ability tests offered by the ACSM. Prior to any test, it is important to collect all necessary information about the participant, past, current health record, to make a participant aware of an agreement and receive his consent to conduct the test, to familiarize a participant about the goal, occasionally risk, and expectations of executive test, to evaluate the participant's willingness and disciplinability to devote his maximum effort so that he understands the importance of his performance, to familiarize a participant about the process of a test. The ACFM advises to follow complete evaluation of an athlete. It means to analyze values during the rest time, his body measurements and body compositions, flexibility, joint mobility, muscular and cardiorespiratory endurance. With all these necessary lead-in remarks, it will be easier to understand various tests aimed to analyze motor capacities. Let's start with a test that measures cardiorespiratory endurance. All the tests we're going to talk about are obviously linked with Nordic Walking. Thus, we're going to discuss all motor capacities that are mobilized and boosted, directly or indirectly, during Nordic Walking sessions and tests that we can measure them. Cardiorespiratory endurance is one of the capacities in many studies. It indicates with the help of the VO2 oxygen uptake. In this slide, you can see a reference to a study on health benefits of Nordic Walking. The study compared the beneficial effects of Nordic Walking and a brisk walking without poles on people. It concluded that Nordic Walking can increase the VO2, a significant increase of aerobic endurance that went from 11% to 20% in comparison to walking without poles. When we come across the letters VO2 or VO2 max, we need to know what stands behind them. VO2 max is maximum oxygen uptake and is an indicator related to aerobic endurance. I will provide another parallel with mechanics. We can think of VO2 max as an inter-cylinder capacity. This parallel is often used in sport as well. So, what is it and why is it important? In aerobic sports, our body burns a lot of energy, and this energy is tied with oxygen uptake and its usage. The greater oxygen uptake is, the more oxygen your body consumes, the more energy it will have to perform in aerobic activity. The VO2 is often expressed as an absolute rate, and it is measured in milliliters in 1 minute or as a relative rate, milliliters per kilogram of body weight in 1 minute. The last measurements is even more precise as it relates to body weight and allows to compare accurately VO2 of different athletes or people. Below on the slide, you can also see the formula for how to calculate VO2. Precise measurements of VO2 max provides a rather complex test executed in laboratories with specific equipment. It is usually measured via open circuit spirometry or indirect calorimetry, which allows quantifying the amount of air an athlete breathes in and out during an exercise. The exercise is often incremental. The intensity of it increases continuously, and an athlete gradually reaches his limit. It allows to evaluate progressively the capacity of an athlete to produce energy and consume oxygen until an athlete reaches his maximum effort at the end of the exercise. During the test, a participant breathes through a specific mouthpiece and with his nose closed, with the nose clip. The test evaluates pulmonary ventilation and exchange of oxygen, carbon dioxide during respiration. Then there are some submaximal exercise tests that provide us with approximate results of measurements of the VO2 max. They are easier to execute as they don't require special laboratories, expensive equipment, and qualified technologists. Submaximal exercise tests are done following standardized exercises and procedures linked to VO2 max rate. If we need to compare two tests, let's say the second type, submaximal test, provides less accurate results, but it also requires less equipment, preparation, trained staff, and physical effort from a subject. We can conclude that the tests are different, and there are advantages and disadvantages in both of them. The main goal of submaximal tests is to indicate the response of a participant's heart rate when the highest intensity level of an exercise is introduced, and thus to evaluate the VO2 max. This is possible with the help of some parameters. One of them is humeral arterial pressure that can be measured through a digital blood pressure cuff. It measures pressure obtained through the exercise. Workload expressed in watt, minutes, percentage, kilometer per hour of an ergometer relating to perceived exertion. Using all of these parameters, we can evaluate the results, effects of exercises, and prescribe and incorporate exercises into training. Another useful tool to evaluate an exercise is a field test. It is a type of submaximal test that makes inferences to calculate VO2 max. There is a subject is asked to walk or run some distance for a particular period of time. We can determine certain positive features of this type of test. It is easy to execute. It can involve several participants simultaneously and requires minimum equipment. The downside will be this test can be still challenging for some people. For example, inactive people, people with particular health or skeletal muscle problems who can't show their highest capacity during walking or running. One of the most known field tests to evaluate aerobic endurance is the Cooper test. In this test, the subject is asked to cover a maximum distance in a fixed period of time, which is 12 minutes. The subject determines his own speed while walking fast or running as far as he can. In the slide, you can see the formula used to calculate VO2 max. Once the Cooper test is done, the subject is asked to push his limits while performing the test. He is instructed to maintain a constant pace during running or walking and stop when 12 minutes are up, upon the given signal. It is important to precisely record the total number of kilometers during the 12-minute test. Results of the test depend a lot on the motivation, resilience of a person. Another popular test that's suggested by the ACSM is called the 1.5 mile test. Its distance equals 2,400 meters. If the Cooper test predetermines the time of running, then the 1.5 mile test predetermines a fixed distance to cover with the time recorded. In this slide, you can see another formula to calculate the VO2 max in this test. To execute this test, you should find a flat running course of 2,400 meters. Mark it with cones. Instruct the subject to cover the whole distance using maximum speed while fast walking or running. To support both tests, I found this systematic view, a meta-analysis that assess validity of tests based on fixed time or fixed distance to estimate cardiorespiratory endurance. And results of these studies show that both tests provide reliable results in terms of measuring VO2 max when there is no way to execute tests in a laboratory with special equipment. Another popular test is called a Rockport walk test. It is a perfect match for people who practice Nordic walking, as it is based exactly on walking. On speed of walking, the RWT is the 1 mile test, which equals 1,609 meters. The goal is to walk a mile as fast as possible. The equation is there in a slide. So to calculate the value of the VO2 max, we also need to know the gender, age, weight, and heart rate of a person. Prior to the test execution, it is essential to find the flat course of a mile so the subject can keep his pace properly. And it's required to measure the subject's heart rate immediately in 10 seconds after the end of the test. Insert this value in the formula. Then in this slide, you can see the front page of a study which evaluated the validity of aerobic fitness during tests among American Air Force males. It concluded that the 1 mile walk can be a great alternative to the 1.5 mile run test in order to measure VO2 max. Now let's talk about tests to evaluate muscle strength. When we mention muscle strength, we need to distinguish several types of it, as there are different ways to define the muscle's capacity to overcome resistance. One of the numerous definitions of maximum strength is the muscle capacity to exert force in one repetition. For example, a weightlifter can voluntarily contract muscles to overcome resistance in one repetition. This is the maximum weight he is able to lift. Then there is also muscle resistance, the capacity to continue exerting efforts against intensity loads. The levels of intensity loads are here submaximal. As we provide an example with rugby earlier, there is a submaximal repetitive muscle resistance efforts being exerted during a match, 2 40-minute halves. And there's also muscle power, or in other words, capacity to exert force in a specific period of time. As an example of a shot put performance, an athlete exerts the force in a short period of time to accelerate the shot. We can conclude the shorter the exertion force time, the heavier mass of an object soon to be thrown leads to a higher muscle power. Force can be also static or dynamic. Static force refers to the force when a muscle is engaged but doesn't move. This classical static force is also known as the isometric force. The typical isometric exercise can be observed in artistic gymnastics when an athlete needs to maintain a certain pose for some time. And instead, a typical dynamic force example is the already mentioned example of a weightlifter whose muscles need to overcome resistance, move one or several times. There are several ways to measure static or isometric force. Some of the tools are quite specific and can be found only in laboratories aimed at measuring forces. Most common tools, however, are cable tensiometers and dynamometers. The results are expressed in newtons. Measurements of static force access a muscle force at a specific angle and an isometric joint movement. During isometric exercise, muscles stay tense without visible movements in joints, but they still contract. These measurements are rather accurate, but can evaluate total muscle force. And there are tests that evaluate dynamic force. They are measured 1 RM, 1 repetition maximum. The highest resistance that can be overcome with a complete ROM while maintaining a good posture. It is often difficult to measure RM, as tests are rather challenging for people or athletes to succeed in doing a specific exercise in a single repetition in a controlled way. The test can be slightly modified without losing its validity. For instance, 3, 5, 8 repetitions, and not 10 can be still acceptable to insert in a formula to calculate the maximum value of measured dynamic force. We need to remember that these tests are specific and aimed at measuring one type of muscle in a certain position. And sometimes it shows less engagement of a particular muscle when in another situation they are more engaged. This position of measuring isolated muscle activation can be downside of these tests. Still, when running a test, we should pay attention to the speed of a muscle movement to understand whether we measure muscle strength or muscle power. It is also important to take into consideration the type of equipment we use and the range of movement to understand whether we deal with isometric or dynamic force. I would like to talk about another interesting study that tested the hand grip strength. The hand grip strength and the strength expressed by the quadriceps resulted to a great indicator of health in adults, especially in the elderly. In other words, it indicates that people who show better hand grip and quadriceps strength have better health and less disabilities in daily living. These measurements could be a good sign of health. And for those people who practice Nordic walking, this study can be even more important as the hand grip strength is trained during the Nordic walking. When we open and close our hands continuously as we release the pose, it can benefit the hand grip strength and cause better blood circulation in hands in the long term. The hand grip strength can be measured with the help of a simple dynamometer. For example, the one you see here. It can be ordered online on the internet. A person should squeeze the dynamometer with all their strength several times to obtain accurate results. You can also see the detailed instructions on the screen. The ACSM also offers some data on the hand grip strengths and even provides scores on performance, ranging from poor to excellent, based on different categories distinguished by gender and age. Here I should mention that the company Gable introduced special e-poles on the market. Inside the handles, there is a measurement device that can calculate hand openings and closings. Example, the hand grip strength, and evaluate the whole Nordic walking technique, as well as in athletes and people who practice this sport. Following up on the topic of muscle strength measurements connected with Nordic walking, I would like to focus your attention on this Italian study on muscular metabolic responses to different techniques in Nordic walking. It concluded that the proper execution of Nordic walking improves cardiovascular endurance and leads to a higher muscular engagement. For example, it leads to higher activation of the triceps brachii. Example, the main extender muscle of the elbow joint, and also latissimus dorsi, and the posterior deltoids. In general, Nordic walking enhances muscular endurance as it represents a cycle activity with repeated movements. Thus, Nordic walking body weight works as a load. Isn't an ideal activity to grow maximum muscle strength, but rather muscle endurance. The ACSM also offers us to use several tests to measure endurance. In particular, it suggests push-up tests during which a subject does the maximum push-ups in a specific period of time and the curl up test to evaluate abdominal strength. Nevertheless, quite recently, the ACSM has doubted the validity of the curl up test in evaluating endurance of the abdominals, as there are other muscles involved. For example, thigh flexors. Still, this test remains very popular, and it is widely used to assess core strength of sports persons. And here you can see the normative tables with fitness categories for the push-up and curl-up test. These are performance classifications according to gender and age. Let's talk about tests on flexibility, or to be more precise, on joint mobility. As I mentioned in previous lectures, Nordic Walking increases participants' joint mobility due to repetitive practice. I will also mention the E-pose from Gable. Thanks to the acceleratory meters inside the pose, it is possible to accurately evaluate the swings of the pose during a period of time, measure articular movements during Nordic Walking activity. I also need to mention that the tests are done to evaluate separately various joint movements on a particular body part. There are no tests that measure total flexibility of an athlete. The test of the ROM is usually done in laboratories, and results are expressed in degrees. Special devices as chronometers, electrodronometers, inclinometers, and even tape measures are common tools to evaluate flexibility. Obviously, the first two provide more accurate results. Another commonly used and simple flexibility test advised by the ACSM is the sit and reach test. The test is easy to execute even without special equipment. The basic outline of the test is that a participant is on the floor with legs stretched out straight ahead. He stretches forward along the measuring line as far as possible. Then the participant reaches the point, holds that position for a while for the distance to be recorded. In the slide, you can see normative data for the sit and reach test. To wrap up this explanation part on the test, I will mention 3 other types of measure spinal mobility. There are forward flexion, for example, shoulder test, extension and lateral flexation test. They are commonly used due to their simplicity and time efficiency. You don't need equipment rather than a tape measure. Still, they are not rigorously standardized tests. Another important indicator of a physical state is body composition. Let's talk a bit about BMI, body mass index, a measure of body fat. It's a commonly used measurement for determining whether a person of a normal weight, overweight, or obese. BMI is a value obtained from the mass and height of a person. The formula to calculate BMI is simple. You need to divide weight by height in meters squared. Then there is waist circumference that can also give some information about the body composition of a person. Waistline is measured between the rib cage and the belly button. A tape measure is used while a person is standing with his abdominals relaxed. In the slide, you can see some widely used measurements to define whether a person is of good health or he should take some actions to get a better physical shape. Another parameter of overall health is the ratio between the waist and hips, or the waist to hip ratio, WHR. This proportion is calculated by dividing waist measurements by hip measurements. It is considered to be more precise than regular waistline measurements, as it gives more accurate data on fat distribution in a body and risks connected with this. These values are very important as they can be indicators of metabolic and cardiovascular risk. The values reflect excess abdominal fat, and it's worth paying attention to the high value of waist circumference, and WHR test to prevent or fight diseases. This slide shows an example of different physical characteristics of a person and how the BMI index and the WHR test are used to calculate body visceral fat and health risk factors. And I would like to touch on another topic before we finish. The tests that are used to evaluate health in elderly people. The ACSM also specifies different values for people over 60 and 65 years old. The human body shows different motor capacities in young and elderly subjects. Thus, we need to use different evaluations made up especially for the elderly. For example, one of these tests is the senior fitness test. The test is primarily used to evaluate physical health of people above 60 years old. The senior fitness test represents a set of tests that evaluate various fitness aspects of the elderly. It measures aerobic, endurance, strength, mobility of upper and lower limbs, agility, and equilibrium of elderly people. Below, you can see the components included in a senior fitness test. For example, in the chair stand-up test, we can measure lower limb strength by counting the number of stands a person can perform in 30 seconds. Then the bicep curl test calculates the repetitions of a dumbbell curl in 30 seconds on a dominant arm side. The chair sit and the reach test is a modification of the sit and reach test. This test is executed when a person is sitting on the edge of a chair. Here we measure the flexibility of a person who tries to reach forward towards his feet. The back scratch test evaluates the scapular shoulder mobility and measures the distance between fingertips when hands are placed on the back. The time up and go test is a kind of gait assessment or time that's needed to stand up and pass a short distance, marked on the floor with a cone. Turn, come back, and sit down. This test assesses the agility and coordination. And the last test, 6-minute walk or 2-minute step test, evaluate muscle and aerobic endurance. Here, a subject is asked to begin stepping and lifting legs as many times as possible for 2 minutes, or walk a distance for 6 minutes. Here we will finish our lecture. Thank you for your attention. See you next time.